Thank you. We were sitting in a small roped off area at the edge of a remote village in northern Senegal, being briefed on the day's planned activities. The year was 1997 and I had recently been appointed as the finance director of Oxfam. I was in my late 30s. I'd left Kathy at home with our 4 children, and this was the first time I had ever been outside Western Europe. I think the count's now up to something over about 75 countries, so I've sort of been making up for lost time since then. As I was listening to the briefing the group of us were getting about the plans for the day, I found myself visually distracted by one of the men from the village leading a couple of animals nearby and then stopping perhaps 20 meters away. And then it gradually dawned on me that what I was watching was lunch being killed. There was no sound from the sheep or the goat, but soon they were hung up in the nearby tree, and I could watch as their carcasses were very skillfully butchered, while all the time trying to keep at least half an ear on the briefing to which we were supposed to be listening. Well, lunchtime came. I'd never eaten goat before, but I can tell you it was very tasty, and we enjoyed eating lunch together. This evening's meal has been a bit different, but equally tasty, I have to say. As well as fresh, very fresh, goat and lamb, as I recall, the rest of lunch consisted of locally grown vegetables and pulses, some sort of bread for which the flour was probably transported to the village from some other part of the country. And we ate that meal together. The Western leadership of Oxfam in the UK in the late 1990s, middle-class Senegalese people from the capital, Dakar, and the villagers who were our hosts in the local settlement where we were staying. Food had brought us together, as indeed it's done for us here this evening, and helped build relationships between these 3 very different groups of people. Indeed, between people who couldn't talk to each other without translators from the local language, Wolof. Now, this summer school that many of you here have been participating in has been focusing not only on food, but as you would expect with anything involving the Jubilee Centre, on relationships. Relationships between humans. The relationship between humans and the natural world, the environment. And as we think about those themes, well, we live, some people think, to eat, but we certainly eat to live. We can't live without eating, and preferably to live healthily. But food, as we've seen this evening, can also function in other ways to provide pleasure for ourselves, to provide a sense of identity to a community, to promote sociality or relationships. And more broadly, our food and our eating are probably the place where we have our most profound engagement with the natural world. So, as we reflect in this postprandial period, I want to pose 4 questions about the food we eat. The first question is it good for me? Food affects our bodies, And God is concerned about our physical bodies. The Judeo-Christian tradition, and indeed the Islamic tradition, sees the physical as an expression of God and his creativity. And this, of course, goes back to the creation stories at the start of the scriptures, where the universe and all that is in it is a direct expression of the creativity of God. But the Christian faith goes further than that and calls on Christians to see their human body as somehow sacred. Your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit, as Paul writes in 1 Corinthians 6. So, how are we doing in treating the temple of the Holy Spirit, our bodies, and specifically in relation to the food we put into it? We know that food affects our physical, our psychological, and indeed our spiritual health. Well, not from a Christian background, but the American author Michael Pollan, I don't know which way you pronounce it. Oh, some of you have come across his work, have you? He tried to capture his dietary advice in 8 words, which I thought is the shortest diet I've ever heard of. Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. Or for those of you from the south of England, plants. Now, to put some meat on the bones of that advice, that's a rather inappropriate expression. He published a book called Food Rules, with 64 rules for eating. Now, you have to bear in mind he was writing primarily with an American audience in his front of his mind, but his rules make pithy reading and headlines and capture many insights. So I'm not going to go through all 64, but here's a few that particularly struck me. Rule 19. If it came from a plant, eat it. If it was made in a plant, leave it. Rule 20. It's not food if it arrived through the window of your car. Rule 36. Don't eat breakfast cereals that change the colour of your milk. Rule 44. Pay more, eat less. However, that's immediately followed by the even shorter Rule 45. Eat less. Perhaps Rule 47 can help with this. Eat when you are hungry, not when you are bored. And Rule 37 is rather stark, and apologies for any implied criticism to the what we received earlier this evening. The whiter the bread, the sooner you'll be dead. Which he elaborates by urging that we eat whole grains and minimise your consumption of white flour. To which we might add, by the way, sugar. To quote the Canadian Sugar Institute, which is funded by the sugar industry, quote, sugar is a source of carbohydrate and energy. On its own, sugar has no other nutrients. Well, since virtually all of us already eat more than enough carbohydrate, refined sugar is for most of us nutritionally useless. In fact, this reminds me of when I went to a Christian conference many, many years ago in Swanwick. Some of you will immediately know the Christian Conference Centre I'm thinking of. And there was a doctor there called Dr. Leon Ledoux from, I remember his name, from Chester-le-Street. And he did this session on personal health. And he said, I'm going to assume as I'm talking to a Christian audience that you don't smoke and you don't drink to excess. If you do, you should stop, but I'm assuming you don't. I've got 3 messages. Number 1, maintain a healthy body weight. Number 2, get regular exercise. Number 3, cut out refined sugar. And I was so shocked that he put that as the 3rd, because I knew about weight and exercise, that I decided I would have to have a program to get off 2 sugars of sugar in my tea. And a year later I went back to the same conference and I'd got down to 1 sugar in my tea. Unfortunately for me, on one evening I was sitting at the table and he was sitting just opposite me, and the sugar was there. So I said, would you mind passing the sugar? But before you say anything, this time last year I was on 2 sugars in tea. I'm down to 1, and if you'll come back next year, I will be off it altogether. And I was. But it's still difficult because I loved then and I still love now biscuits, pastries, cakes, chocolate, all that stuff, and so on. So I was relieved that rule 64, the last rule, is this: break the rules once in a while. So we know that there are some other things for our health we ought to reduce: processed meat like ham and bacon, and too much saturated animal fats like, unfortunately, cheese, which I also love. But what a joy that the chocolate mousse we enjoyed just now had no animal fat in it. I hope you enjoyed it. So the first question to ask about your food is whether it is good for you. But significantly, one of Poland's 64 food rules is Rule 58. Try not to eat alone. The second question then about our food is this: is it good for us? Eating is often a communal activity. Now, of course, a larger proportion of people, particularly in the West, now live alone. But even so, there are very many opportunities to eat with others. As you heard, I run the secretariat that supports the work of this group called the Elders, a group of mainly former presidents and former secretary generals and those kind of people. And they meet together, working on peace and human rights. And they meet together twice a year for 3 days each time. And interestingly, the way the group is set up, those meetings include, those who wish to come, their spouses. And of course, it includes eating together: breakfast, lunch, dinners, tea breaks, and so on. And so as well as the formal sessions, there's an extraordinary chance for fellowship, for interaction, for relationships to be built across the group. And it's striking how often, when the elders are remembering stories of important events, some of those include conversations over a meal. For instance, I remember the late Kofi Annan, the former chair, recalling a crucial meeting with Colonel Gaddafi over a meal in Gaddafi's tent in the desert. Now, curiously, I think that some of the most awful eating experiences live longer in our communal memories than the most wonderful tasting ones. I mean, can you remember the worst meal you've ever had with others? Mine is probably the evening meal I had with colleagues from Transparency International in Moscow, at which I had fish, and at some point the next morning found myself gradually coming to consciousness again, having vomited and fainted in the middle of the night in a strange hotel room near Red Square. And when ringing up reception to say, was it possible to get some water and could they help, I got a one-word answer: no. Miklos and I, who shared that, the meal, not the subsequent experience, but have remembered that occasion many times. But whether nasty or nice, eating together provides opportunities for conversation and builds up our common life. Just think of the times that Jesus spent eating and doing things with food with his disciples. When Kathy and I were younger and our children were living at home with us, we used to try to have at least one, what we called sort of special family meal together at the weekend, when we would all eat in a different room from where we normally ate, in the kitchen, with the table all nicely laid out, and make an occasion of whatever the food was. So food is an important facilitator of relationships. But we also have to remember that eating together doesn't have to be elaborate. I mean, a gala dinner is wonderful, but if this is the only way we feel it's okay to eat together, that precludes us doing it very often, particularly as churches. So the ability to share soup, mainly plant-based, and bread, preferably wholemeal, after church can be an important way to build up the life of a church. And indeed, the Christian church has, for most of it, the Christian church has at the heart of its worship the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper or the Mass or whatever you call it. But you know, if we're to follow the biblical injunction, whenever you do this, remember me, we need to remember that it was after supper he took the cup. I mean, whatever happened to the supper? You know, most churches I go to, no, there's no food. It's just a tiny bit of bread and a tiny thing. At our church, usually, you know, we have a bit of real bread, and you sort of pull off a bit of your own, and you see these people, they take this minuscule bit, whereas I'll go up and hold the thing, rip a bit of the crust off as well, and think, well, if this is Jesus, you know, let's share some food together, not some... Anyway, don't get me started. Right, back to the plot. What that shows, though, I think, is that often in the Christian church we've lost the communal meal eating part of the Passover tradition, which Jesus embraced and was the context in which he asked his followers to do this. Now, many of us have been noting the anniversary of the moon landing. In fact, just to explain, I hope some of you noted that the bow tie is Wallace and Gromit from their special trip to the moon, because there was no cheese on Earth, and we all know the moon had lots of cream cheese. As you may or may not know, the first meal on the moon was bread and wine. In a one-person celebration of the Lord's Supper. Buzz Aldrin, the Apollo 11 astronaut, marked that incredible occasion by celebrating Holy Communion with bread and wine in the lunar capsule, while Neil Armstrong, who didn't share his faith, looked on. Interestingly, the reason NASA didn't publicise that was because they were still being sued for having had astronauts reading from Genesis in Apollo 8, was it? That was still going through the courts. And strikingly, given that the Lord's Supper is essentially a communal event rather than an individual event, Aldrin's church near Houston, Texas, where he lived and was an elder, they were participating in a communion service at roughly the same time. And Aldrin subsequently wrote, "It was interesting to think that the very first liquid ever poured on the moon and the first food eaten there were communion elements." When he instructed his followers to share bread and wine together, Jesus connected this with remembering, and often shared meals are times to remember people, to remember occasions, to remember events that we have in common, which strengthens our relationships and our common life. So eating should often be together, and it should be good for us. So is it good for me? Is it good for us? And thirdly, is it good for them? Few, if any, people eat only food which they have grown and prepared themselves. To eat is to connect ourselves with a supply chain, often a very long supply chain, in which others have worked. So what are our food choices doing to them? Is the food that we buy and eat good for them? For some years in the 1990s, I was the chair of Tradecraft plc and subsequently was a non-executive director of Shared Interest, which is a financial cooperative based in the northeast, which finances fair trade. Fair trade, of course, seeks to increase the welfare of those involved in the production of fair trade goods, including food. And it's made a lot of progress. And indeed now, that sort of principle of wanting to know more about the provenance of your food is spreading. Some supermarkets in the UK have started to tell us more about those involved in our food chain. I should say it's empty, so don't worry. This box of eggs that I bought at Tesco last week informs me that the eggs were laid by hens that roam freely over tree-sheltered fields and were packed on the family farm of Charles Mere near Sandy in Bedfordshire, not so far from here. Now you might think, well, that's all very well, but come on, we need a lot of eggs. Well, Mr. Mere's farm has 28,000 free-range hens. They lay around 25,000 eggs a day. That's about 1.5 million boxes of eggs a year. And it's going to become much easier to provide and obtain information like this, and not only when it's printed for us on the pack. By using QR codes, for instance, that people will be able to establish much more about the supply chain that is behind the food that they buy. But that, of course, relies on effective information and effective assurance systems. So do you remember the horse meat scandal, where we discovered that some beef burgers had got horse meat in them? That was largely down to fraud in the supply chain, to pressure to provide meat at lower and lower prices, sometimes uneconomic prices. At that time I was serving on the Executive Advisory Board on Sustainability at Marks & Spencer. And interestingly, Marks & Spencer were confident that there would not be found to be any horse meat in their burgers, and indeed there wasn't, because they were confident they knew their supply chains. So, you budding social reformers, think supply chains, think standards, think advocating for their adoption, persuading others to accept and implement higher standards in their businesses. Think assurance provision. Yes, even accountants and auditors can have a role in social reform. But above all, think about the people involved in the food business. Is whatever you're doing and eating good for them? And finally, is it good for all? The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, says the psalmist in Psalm 24 verse 1. The world and all its inhabitants. Well, as the latest natural history series about the natural world, Our Planet, has again reminded us, we all share a common home, our one and only planet. I mean, there may be the prospect of something on Mars at some point, but I think for the moment we can rely on the fact that for most humans it's this one. And the Pope, of course, back in 2015 published that encyclical, Laudato Si', where he talks about, or the Catholic Church through him talks about, our common home, tapping into the long tradition of Catholic social teaching on the common good. For Christians, this, in my view, should all be and have been more than familiar from our reading of Scripture and its celebration of the natural world. And we should, in that sense, be natural ardent environmentalists, relating concern for the state of the planet to the well-established theological tradition of seeking the common good. Because without a healthy planet, you can't have healthy communities and people. So in what ways do my food choices contribute to or detract from the common good? Well, as we know, the planet is literally heating up, and concern about the state of the environment is heating up metaphorically. A recent sign of this is the emergence of Extinction Rebellion and other groups and movements devoted to saving our planet. So perhaps now is an important time for Christians to rediscover our environmental theology and heritage, as groups like A Rocha have helped us to do. And in fact, I think there was somebody I read who from A Rocha. Ah, yeah, great. Protecting the environment whilst utilising it for human well-being and welfare is one of the great challenges of our time. Partly simply because there are more humans and we have the technological capacity to have more impact on the environment than we ever did have before, particularly before the Industrial Revolution. So let me try to indicate just some of the dimensions about how we might think about this. I mean, it's a huge topic, and you've been grappling with some of that this week, and there's just been there's a paper, or at least I've seen a summary of the paper out just now on that from here. So, three things we might think about. Firstly, air, that is to say the quality and composition of the atmosphere. By quality, I include pollution of all kinds, but I'll focus a bit more on composition. That is to say, in particular, how much CO2 and other greenhouse gases is there in the atmosphere. Now, I'm not going to rehearse here the evidence and issues associated with the way that human activity is changing the climate, but I thought I'd just tell you a brief story about my encounter with a government minister on the matter. I think I'll just move this egg box. I was having a meeting with John Hayes, who was then Energy Minister in the then Department of of Energy and Climate Change, DEC, when I was the Chief Executive of WWF, the environmental charity. Been in late 2012, early 2013. And I have to tell you, it was one of the most unusual meetings I've ever had with a government minister, for a number of reasons. Anyway, we discussed, well, partly he started telling us about his garden and his birds and feeding the birds in his garden. I wasn't quite sure how this connected with government energy policy. Anyway, we did then get on to that, and we discussed various aspects of it, and particularly the need to stop using coal as quickly as possible. And towards the end of the meeting, he suddenly, quite out of the blue, asked me whether I believed in God. So I could see the civil servants sort of who were taking notes of the meeting stop and wonder, so do we write that down? I mean, is that is that part of the government's official records? You see, I don't know why. Perhaps he'd noticed from his briefing that I'd got a couple of theology degrees or something. Anyway, I said I did, you see. And then he said something else, and I was desperately thinking, well, what can I say that might sort of connect? He'd raised the subject of God with all the stuff about climate change and energy. So I said I sometimes wondered what God thought about climate change and our use of fossil fuels, which was contributing to it. And I said, well, I don't know, I said, but maybe God sees it this way. He made the earth with some coal and oil pretty easily accessible, so that we could get going with the Industrial Revolution and all the benefits that brought. But ensured that most of the rest of the coal and oil was buried deep down where it was very difficult and very dangerous and expensive to get at it. Whereas he'd ensured that the sun, solar, wind, wave, energy, and the moon for tides, I'm not sure I mentioned the moon actually, would be very obvious. There they were. It was very obvious. Here's a source of energy. So maybe God was rather puzzled as to why, especially now, when we knew about the climate change problem, that we hadn't taken the hint to use the easily accessible and safer sources of energy rather than the inaccessible and dangerous ones. So John Hayes thought for a moment, and then he said that this was the first time in his government career that anyone had given him a theological perspective on energy policy. Well, I'm not claiming that theological perspective on fossil fuels is necessarily correct, but we do have to be thoughtful about the climate impact of our food. And in fact, around that time, WWF did a project on diets, looking at how a diet that was healthy for humans, using the DEFRA well-being definition, could also be healthy for the planet. And in fact, we defined health for the planet purely in terms of carbon, just to keep it really simple. The news was that the big picture that came out of that work was that what is healthy for us individually is healthy for us collectively and for the rest of nature. I mean, anyone would think someone might have designed it like that. A diet rich in plants and low in meat, especially red meat and dairy, is good for both us and the planet. So, air. How do we ensure that what we're doing in terms of our buying and eating food is not damaging the air, particularly its composition, in terms of climate change? Secondly, water. Food is one of the biggest drivers of water use. About 70% of fresh water is used in agriculture, and as human demand, particularly for meat, which is fed with grain, increases, this puts enormous pressure on water systems. And tensions around the world are mounting on water. The most recent meeting of the elders in April was in Addis Ababa, and it included a long 3-hour meeting with the new Prime Minister, Abiy Ahmed, and one of the topics of conversation at our meeting and lunch with him, yes, interestingly, a lunch with him, part of that food, relationships, bonding stuff, part of that was talking about the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, known as the GERD. This dam, largely completed now, will control those waters of the Nile which flow from Ethiopia to Egypt. And Egypt gets, I think, about 99% of its water from the Nile. So this is the life of Egypt. There is no agriculture, there's nothing without the Nile waters. So how we manage water and the impact of the food demand and agricultural demand on the demand for water is crucial in thinking about, will our food habits be good for all? And third, land, in particular forests and soil. Demand for agricultural land, as I mentioned, for animal feed is one of the principal factors driving deforestation of virgin forests in places like Brazil and Indonesia. And of course, the destruction of those forests connects to climate change because of the water cycle, an increase in disruption to that and the way rain falls and consequent flooding and droughts and so on. But also soil is being eroded and deteriorating through intensive agriculture and the use of chemicals and so on. Now, I suspect that estimates that have been put out there that we have around 60 harvests left are rather simplistic and probably alarmist. But the deterioration of soils and soil quality, which demands more fertilizer, which eventually gets into the water supply and pollutes rivers and ultimately the oceans, is a serious risk to human well-being, not to mention ecological systems. And factory farming is one source of many of these issues. And this stretches also into health concerns. One of the programs of the elders is around universal health coverage, how to make sure everybody has access to the basic health care they need without getting into financial distress. And one of the threats to achieving universal health coverage is the looming threat of AMR, antimicrobial resistance. That is, bugs that are harmful to humans or lethal to humans not being able to be controlled by antibiotics because they've mutated to become resistant to them. One of the big drivers of AMR is the routine application of antibiotics to livestock, especially in the context of factory farming. Now, we've seen then air, water, land, those three sort of parts of the natural world are all affected by our food choices. And I recognise that this is all rather hard to measure. There's no simple way to capture and compare environmental impacts. For instance, in the 1990s, I was working in the packaging industry. I was the finance director of European Packaging Group. And at that time, packaging waste, which is of course a bad thing, was measured by weight. And the consequence was that plastics did well because they were light, and cardboard, which is what the company I worked for was using, was struggling a bit because the plastics could always come up with a lighter version, so they had less waste than we did. Well, we now know there are issues with plastics which there are not with recyclable cardboard. But then, hang on, isn't even perhaps a small amount of plastic, which preserves food better than food waste, which would otherwise arise if you didn't have the plastic, maybe that bit of plastic's okay? Yeah, so again, it's complicated. There's no simple, easy, quick solution to these issues. So we're going to have to engage the intelligence and expertise of scientists, of practitioners, of business people, everybody, to work together to solve these big problems. And there are going, I think, to be many dilemmas ahead, not least the prospect of factory-produced meat. That is to say, not factory farms, not artificial meat made out of plants, but real meat grown in a factory without the use of animals. So you take cells and you culture them and you put them in a sort of liquid stuff with lots of nutrients, and you can grow meat. At the moment it's unbelievably expensive to do it, but if the cost comes down, guess what? There'll be factories producing this kind of meat, I suspect. What do we think of that? Or what about the idea of moving to a more insect-based diet? Now, at least that has the advantage of being biblical. You know, John the Baptist, locusts and wild honey. So I hope Christians are not going to react, negatively to the idea of us eating insects. Anyway, whatever we are to think of the changes that are likely to be coming down the food, technology and manufacturing and provision chain, let's be considering the common good of humanity and of the non-human creation as that happens, the earth and all its inhabitants. Now, I do recognise that sometimes you think, oh my goodness, this is all just getting a bit overwhelming. I mean, I just want to eat some food, So let's be thankful that God has designed things so that we can enjoy food together, as well as it confronting us with dilemmas, challenges, and issues that we need to discuss and grapple with. So it's time, I think, for me to finish my remarks. We have choices about what, how, and with whom we eat. And these choices have real consequences for ourselves, for our relationships, for others, and ultimately for God's creation, our planet. Our food choices influence and affect others, our families, our friends, our work colleagues, but they also affect those we'll never meet who are involved in the growing, the production, the distribution and the sale of our food, and ultimately affect everyone and the state of the planet Earth that we share with the rest of creation. So my challenge and encouragement to you is to buy and to eat, often together, so that your food choices are good for you, good for us, good for them, and good for all. Thank you.